little bit of church history stories to you. Some entertainment. Porter Rockwell is a legend in our church history. I know kids here in Lehi, where I live, that are named Porter. Porter was from Lehi for a time. He had a home here in Lehi, and so that's my claim to fame, is to being where Porter, at one time at least in his life, was. But to get the real story of Porter, I've got to tell it in two different parts. I want to keep it as chronological as I can, but I'm going to do it chronologically backwards, meaning that I'm going to start with the time that Porter and the rest of the saints left Nauvoo. I'm going to tell you all the stories about what happened in Utah, because that's the stories that people know. Those are the stories that people love. Those are the times when Porter was a deputy marshal. He was the law, and he took the law into his hand, and at times when people didn't cooperate and people broke the law, people ended up dead. And it's those shoot 'em up Western type stories that people really love, and those are the ones that are popular. That's what made Porter Rockwell a legend. However, if we were to get his point or his perspective on how he'd like to be remembered, it's the first half of the chronological story that I'm going to do second, and that is from when he was 6 years old until the martyrdom of Joseph Smith. And it's during that time period, about 1817 to 1844, where Porter Rockwell was really making a name for himself in the church, and it had nothing to do with guns. And it's those little known and oftentimes completely unknown stories about Porter Rockwell that I think is what he would be most proud of, and that those are the stories that he would most like to be considered a legend for. So even though it's not out on the western frontier, while he was in Kirtland and Independence and Palmyra and Nauvoo and whatnot, they're still thrilling, exciting stories that only could be delivered by Orrin Porter Rockwell. So I'm going to do a chronological order, but backwards. We're going to start with the Utah stories first, and then I'm going to tell you the unknown stories that happened earlier in church history. So Joseph Smith loved Porter. Porter was his personal bodyguard, and at the passing of Joseph, when Brigham Young became leader of the church and then eventually president of the church, Porter was right next to Brigham. Brigham trusted Porter. Not only trusted Porter with his own life, but he trusted Porter on some of the most important missions. The first mission that he would have as assigned to him by Brigham was to be a part of the Vanguard Company, or that first group of pioneers that went from Nauvoo to what would become known as winter quarters, then into the Salt Lake Valley. He was the scout, meaning he was a few days ahead of everybody else, checking out the trail, telling Brigham which way to go, and safely guiding the saints into the Salt Lake Valley. Now, we don't know how many scouts there were. We do know that he was one of the scouts, and so whether he was the first or at most second or third member of the church into the Salt Lake Valley, he was here first. And so he helped escort the saints right into the Salt Lake Valley. Now, after getting into the Salt Lake Valley, Brigham sent him on several missions. He was sent down to blaze the trail to Southern California, and it went really similarly to where the freeway goes today. It goes south through Utah, through Las Vegas, down into San Bernardino, and onto San Diego, where Porter would meet up with the Mormon Battalion. He also blazed the trail from Salt Lake over to the San Francisco Bay Area. While he was over there, he had to make a living. He was a very good entrepreneur throughout his whole life. At his time in California, he owned hotels, he owned saloons. He tried his hand at panning for gold for a while, and then he realized that he could make more money, what he called panning the gold diggers, than panning for his own gold. And so that's what he did. He set up the saloon. He sold drinks and whatnot to those 49ers and put them up in hotels and sold them shovels and equipment and that sort of thing. And he made quite a bit of money. In fact, he made a lot of money doing just that over in California. But when it was time to come back to Salt Lake, when Brigham needed him here, he took all of that money and donated it to the church. He didn't give 10%. He gave it all. He gave it all back to Brigham for the help of building up the kingdom. Now, before he left California, though, he came across, just by happen chance, a woman by the name of Agnes Smith. Agnes was the widow of Don Carlos Smith, Don Carlos being the younger brother of the prophet. She's out in California. Why is she in California? Because she became dissatisfied with the church. Don Carlos had passed away, and she didn't want anything to do with the saints. She never lost her testimony, but she didn't want anything to do with the saints. And so she moved out to California, where everybody was moving to. And so when Porter came across Agnes, and he found her in a very sick situation. She was sick, her health, with typhoid. And that typhoid drained her health so much so that she lost all of her hair. And you know the story about Porter. He had super long hair and a big old beard. And as the story goes, the prophet, and as the story goes, I'll correct it and tell you what actually happened. But as the story goes, what you're familiar with is that the prophet promised that if he left his hair long and if he let his hair grow long, that his enemies wouldn't have the opportunity to kill him. And so with that in mind, you can now get a glimmer of the heart that Porter Rockwell had within him. When he sees Agnes in this pitiful situation, he goes to a barber, cuts all of his hair, goes to a wig maker, fashions a wig, and gives it to the widow of Don Carlos. Now, was she associated with the church? No. Was there any benefit in it for Porter for doing that? No. But what you know about his hair, and I'll clarify that story and repeat it in clarity here in a moment, but what you do know or assume to know about his hair, that was a huge sacrifice, big sacrifice. And he did it because he loved the Smith family. Why did he love the Smith family? Because they were brothers and sisters and in-laws of the prophet Joseph Smith. And Prophet Joseph Smith was dearly beloved by Porter Rockwell. And it's those stories, his association with the prophet, that I'm going to spend most of the time on tonight. And I think those are the stories that Porter would have us repeat tonight. Now, here behind me on my shelf is my bobblehead, Porter Rockwell. All that glorious, wonderful hair is what got cut off for Sister Don Carlos Smith. And there he is. This bobblehead was given to me by a friend of mine. She purchased it in Nauvoo, and I like having it up there to remind me of some of these stories that I'll share with you tonight. Well, we've got Porter Rockwell. He's over in Utah. He's the deputy marshal. He is the law. And so here's some of those fun stories of the wild, wild west. The first one that I'll tell you about happened right here in Lehigh, where I am right now, over on State Street, about a mile from my home. There's a man by the name of Lauren Dibble, Lauren Dibble, and he challenged Porter Rockwell to a shootout right there on State Street. You know, back to back, 10 paces, turn and shoot type of thing. And Porter accepted the challenge. They went out there on State Street in the middle of the day. The crowd gathered around, and Lauren fired his shots. He had 2 guns, 6 bullets in each gun. He fired all 6. Not a single one of them hit Porter. Porter then took out his 2 6-shooters and fired all 12 shots at the feet of Lauren to make him dance. And he's jumping around and trying to dodge these bullets. Porter, now that they're both out of bullets, Porter then ran, grabbed him around the collar, lifted him off the floor, off the street, and he said, "Only because I know of your parentage will I let you live." And he threw him to the ground in disgust, and he walked away. Now, we don't really know the genealogy of Lauren, who his parents were, or at least I haven't looked into it. And so who were his parents, who were his mom and dad that Porter loved so much? I don't know. But it shows, again, we're just showing some character of Porter Rockwell here. Porter had a home here in Lehigh, and he had stables with horses, a little business that he ran. And one day he's out running an errand, and his stable hand, the teenage kid who worked for him, was there, and some guys came looking for Porter, some enemies. And they come and knock on the door, and they said, "Hey, we'd like to come in and take a look at your stable. It looks quite impressive." Guy says, "Sure, come on in, take a look around." They look around, they discover that Porter's not there and that the young man is unarmed. So what do? They shoot up the place, they ransack the place, and then they take off. Porter comes back, and he says, "What happened?" And the kid replied to him exactly what I told you, what happened. And Porter says, "Don't you understand the first law of the West? You shoot first and then invite them to come in." Just part of Porter's humor there. Well, another story, 3 non-members of the church from California. They know about the legendary stories of Porter Rockwell. And they decide to make a bet with each other. And they threw in their money and they said, okay, whoever wins this bet gets all the money. And so they come up to Utah looking for Porter Rockwell. The bet is, who can kill Porter Rockwell. And he has a business out by the point of the mountain. And he's there at the point of the mountain, and he's doing his business and whatnot. And one of these guys from California is hiding in the bushes. Porter decides that he's going to head home to Lehigh, and so he starts walking in from the point of the mountain into his home in Lehigh, and out from behind a bush comes a man on the back of a horse, and he has a gun pointed right at Porter. Well, he tells Porter, "You're going to die, and there's a bet, and I'm going to win it." And Porter says, "Well, you got a problem. You're not going to be able to kill me because you don't have the cap on that pistol." Well, the man glances down at his pistol to see if Porter's correct, and while he takes his eyes off of Porter for even just that 1 second, Porter takes the gun from his pocket and shoots the man. Now, he didn't take it from his pocket. He had a gun in his pocket, and he had to fire and shoot so fast that he didn't bother taking it out of his pocket. He shot a hole right clean through his pocket of his coat, but it hit the man square in the heart, and the man fell over dead, of course losing the wager amongst his friends. Now, here, let's pause for a second. Let's talk about these deaths that occurred at the hands of Porter Rockwell. It's estimated, or at least recorded in history, that he shot and killed 25 men. But not one time, ever, was he found guilty of murder. In all 25 instances, Porter was brought before either a jury or a judge, and he was found innocent because of one of two things. Either one, he was acting in self-defense, it was discovered, or the individual had broken the law and capital punishment was due justice. You see, now what we have to do when we're talking about Porter or any other historical figures, we've got to make sure that we're very careful, that we don't treat them unfairly. To treat a historical figure or anybody who lived in the past, to judge them by today's standards is not fair. You see, today, if you steal a horse, you're not going to get shot. In fact, you might get a fine. You're probably not even going to go to jail. But in Utah, in the 1870s, if you stole a horse, the punishment was to be shot dead. And they didn't need to wait for a trial or a jury or a judge or anything like that. And so Porter, being a legal deputy marshal, was able to take the law into his own hand and administer justice and do so legally. Every time he shot a man and that man died, he would throw him place him in his wagon, take him to the sheriff. The sheriff would investigate, and all 25 times Porter would be found innocent. So those two things, Porter acted within the law, and we need to be careful not to judge an individual of the past by today's standards. As long as we do that, we do okay. Now, let me think of another couple of stories. Now, the stories that I've told so far, those are documented. Those are true. Well, they're documented. And here's another thing about Porter Rockwell stories that we got to remember. Porter couldn't read or write. He couldn't even sign his name. He needed to sign a document when he was in Independence, Missouri. And several men signed their name, and Porter was required to sign it as well. And all he did was sign it with an X, because he couldn't even write the word Porter, or even P.O. for Porter, or P.R. for Porter Rockwell. And so he couldn't read or write. So any story about Porter Rockwell is at least secondhand, and maybe even further down the line than that. He has no journal, and so any story that we have is this person told this person who told that person. However, standing in the tabernacle at the pulpit, Brigham Young claimed that Porter Rockwell was the most honest man he had ever met in his life. Now, just because Porter was the most honest man Brigham had ever met, that doesn't mean that his stories haven't been fabricated or embellished a little bit. So I have told you some stories that are pretty substantially documented. Let me tell you a couple of stories that they're kind of fun, but whether they're true or not, or how true they are, it's kind of up to you. Now, if you go, State Street is this way from my house. If you go this way out to the western mountains, the western hills, you come across a sign in the middle of nowhere and it says Two Dog Cemetery. That area is called Two Dog Cemetery. It's not a city or town or anything. There's nothing there. You can camp or hunt or whatever, but Two Dog Cemetery is not too far from the western side of Lehigh. And this is how it got its name, so the story goes. When Johnston's army dispatched by President Buchanan, President of the United States, to come and put a squash on the rebellion that he had heard was going on in Utah, which Johnston found wasn't true. When Johnston came out here, he sent a couple of his troops out to find Porter Rockwell. He was upset with Porter because Porter had done some things to Johnston's army to slow him down in getting out to Utah. All right, I'm doing some tangents here. Let me back up. Johnston's army is sent by the President of the United States out to Salt Lake to make sure that Brigham and all the saints aren't doing anything that's in rebellion to the United States. When they got here, of course, they didn't find any of that. But along their way, Brigham wanted Porter to slow Johnston's army down. So he sends him out to Wyoming. And Porter would just harass Johnston's army to slow him down. He'd sneak into their camp late at night. He'd let all their cattle go. So then they got to spend the next 4 or 5 days gathering up their cattle. He'd set the prairie on fire, so they'd have to wait for the prairie fire to die down and go away so that they could continue on their way. That would take a week or 10 days. And so Porter continued to do all these different things to try to slow Johnston's army down. Well, Johnston wasn't happy with Porter, so he sends a couple of his troops out to Lehigh to go find Porter. Now this comes back to the story I was beginning with, Two Dog Cemetery. So he's out there in those hills west of Lehigh, and the two troops come across this man, who we know is Porter, but they don't know it's Porter, and a couple of dogs. And the two men say to Porter, hey, we're looking for Porter Rockwell. Are you him? Are you Porter? And he says, no, I'm not Porter, but these are his dogs. And knowing just what the troops would do. So the U.S. Army guys pull out their guns, shoot the dogs. And while the dogs are being shot, they take their eyes off of Porter. Porter turns and shoots the two troops, shoots them dead. Could he do that? Yes. Why? The jury found that he acted in self-defense. They were coming to kill Porter. Now, I think it's not ironic, it's hilarious that we don't call it two Johnston Army men camp or something like that, but the spot where it happened, it commemorates Porter's dogs that he loved. And so we call that place affectionately Two Dog Cemetery because we don't worry about Johnston's army, but those dogs, that's where they died. They gave their life protecting Porter. Well, I'll tell you one more story and then we're going to go back to Joseph Smith time. This man's name was Joe Durton, if I'm pronouncing it right, Durton. He was a bank robber, and he committed the crime, and he was trying to escape. Well, in addition to being an excellent marksman with any gun, Porter was also an excellent tracker. He could track people that were 2 or 3 or 4 days ahead of him. He could follow their tracks in the snow or out in the middle of the desert, and he could find them. Well, he's tracking this Joe who had stole some money from a bank. And west of Lehigh, out in Cedar Fort, there was an individual who had a little log home. And as Porter was coming up, the guy goes out, the owner of the home, and he says, hey, this guy you're looking for, he's hiding out in my house. So Porter goes and knocks on the door. And the guy comes out wanting to protect his own life. So he comes out with a 6-shooter and starts firing at Porter. Well, Porter stands there taking the bullets. And the guy who was with Porter, his assistant, said that he saw the flame come out of the gun and go through Porter's body and exit the other side. It was a miracle. The Lord protected Porter in fulfillment of a covenant that Porter made while in Nauvoo with the assistance of Joseph Smith. And those are the stories that I want to turn our attention to, because I think it's those stories that old Port, as Joseph Smith would call him, those are the stories that he would have us remember most, I think. Well, it starts all the way back in the year 1816. The Smiths arrive in Palmyra, and they secure property out at the south end of Palmyra, and that's where the first vision's going to happen, and Moroni's going to happen. But remember the year, 1816, maybe 1817. And they move in, and their next door neighbors are a family by the last name of Rockwell. They've got a 6-year-old boy whose name is Orrin Porter Rockwell. This 6-year-old boy would spend a lot of his time at the Smith family's farm. The Smith family had a lot of kids, And it was fun over there, and he gravitated to the Smith family, and he loved the Smith family. Well, all the Rockwells did, and the Smiths loved the Rockwells. And during wintertime, when they had more time on their hands, they spent a lot of time together. In the summer, spring, summer, and fall time, when they were working on the farm, they'd work hard all day long, and then the two families would get together in the evening time. And so they had a very, very close, good relationship. Now, at this time, Joseph was 13 years old. The first vision had not happened yet. And Porter and Joseph had a bond, a unique bond. Now, neither of them kept a journal at this time, so we had to just connect a few dots to come up with a very good assumption of this relationship. And here's how it goes. Joseph had his leg operation, which caused him to walk with a limp the rest of his life. He's now 13 years old. Porter broke his leg as a little boy, and the doctor didn't set it quite right, or right enough for it to heal properly. And so Porter would walk with a limp the rest of his life. Now you think about a 6-year-old boy probably being teased a little bit by the neighbors and by the people in town and school and whatnot. Well, good thing he's got a 13-year-old adopted brother that lives next door who can empathize and sympathize with Porter and his leg difficulties. And so I imagine here that the two of them not only clung to each other because they had the same trial that they were both suffering with, but I think Porter relied a lot on Joseph to be the big brother type, his defender, his protector, because people, this was pre-first vision, people liked Joseph. People respected Joseph and at that time of his life. And so I think Porter looked to Joseph for that security and whatnot. Well, I also think that Joseph looked to Porter as a bit of support because Porter understood what it was like to have a hurt leg. Well, if I'm right or wrong, somehow they had an instant connection, a wonderful, wonderful bond of friendship. Now, when the first vision happened and 3 years later the Moroni visits took place, the Rockwells were some of the very first people to hear about those stories from Joseph. They heard it, of course, firsthand. Joseph trusted the Rockwells, and the Rockwells believed Joseph. Believed him so much that they would follow him and do anything that would be asked of him. When they had to leave Palmyra, when Joseph and Emma had to leave Palmyra and they went to Harmony and then later into Fayette, and then they would decide, or rather they'd be commanded by the Lord to go to Kirtland. At that point, Joseph looked to members of the church in the New York and Pennsylvania area to go to Kirtland. And as we're starting to move to Kirtland, he then gets the commandment to establish Zion, which was revealed to be down in Jackson County, Missouri. The Rockwells were some of those families that Joseph asked, that Joseph trusted to be able to go without him to go and establish Zion. And so he did. So Porter Rockwell later gets married. He has a home. He lives near his parents, though, and he has a home there in Jackson County. The mobs come. We won't recount the Missouri story tonight. You know it well enough to get an idea of what's going on with Porter so that you can appreciate what he does later in life, knowing a little bit of his background. But the mobs come to the Rockwell home. They're looking for Porter because he's a male member of the church. So at the insistence of his wife, he goes and hides. They come in, harass her, harass his children, knock over the cabin, light it on fire. Before destroying all the property, they took what they wanted and hit the road. Porter came back, disgusted at what had happened. He went back to work, which was operating a ferry. That's how, across the river, and that's how he was making a little bit of money. He was out there operating the ferry one day, and the mob came and found him. They started to harass him. They beat him up. They eventually left without killing him, luckily, but he decided it was at that point that he was no longer going to be without arms, without his Second Amendment right to protect his life, liberty, and his property. And so he armed himself. He didn't know how to shoot a pistol or anything like it. And so he bought a gun and he went out into the woods and he practiced. He practiced and he practiced and he practiced until he became an incredible marksman. So much so that he became famous for how well he could shoot, long before the Utah stories of shooting anybody. And so he was very good with the gun. He was a great defender of himself and all the other members of the church. Well, as the Missouri story goes, they have to get out of Jackson County. They end up in Caldwell County, where the county seat is Far West. They're in Far West. The Mormon militia and the Missouri militia, they're facing off. They face off, and they have a famous battle, or the battle is famous now. It happened at Crooked River. Porter Rockwell was there. He was at Crooked River. The guns were shot, and Porter came out of it obviously alive, but his jacket didn't. Several bullet holes were found within his jacket, but none touched his skin. None gave him a wound. He got out of there, out of Crooked River, and at that point, then Haun's Mill took place, and Joseph says, we got to get out of town, the extermination order, everything else that happened in Missouri. But they had to get out of Far West. There's about 5,000 members of the church in Far West. All of them don't have any money. And Porter had been a good entrepreneur even in his Missouri days. Long before California, he had some good businesses. He had a little bit of money, not much, but more than most. And so what did he do? He sold all of his property, donated the cash that he earned from the sale of his property and the cash that he had in savings and whatnot, and he donated it all to who was the de facto leader at this time, who was Brigham and Heber C. Kimball, because Joseph and Hiram and Sidney were now in jail, in the Liberty Jail. He gave them all the money, and it was Porter's cash that funded the eastward exodus out of Missouri and towards the Mississippi River and eventually into Nauvoo. It was the blessing of Porter Rockwell who were able to finance the Saints to get out of there before any of the mob members could execute the extermination order. Well, while this is all happening and the Saints move out and they're moving into what would become known as Nauvoo, Governor Boggs is one day, he's no longer the governor, but he's still the former governor, the former bad man, the current, still a bad man, and he's in his home. And it's late one night, and his wife and daughter are in the kitchen, and he's excused himself to go to the living room. He sits down and he's reading a newspaper, and a bullet comes through the glass and hits him, kind of below the neck, top of the shoulder area. And it wounds him severely, but it doesn't kill him. He falls over, they call for the doctors, all the townspeople come out to see what the commotion is, and they find a gun left behind underneath the window. It's the only piece of evidence they have as to who the potential killer was. And Governor Boggs, there was no doubt in his mind, it was the Mormons coming to seek revenge on his life. And so he blamed Joseph Smith. And he said, well, it wasn't Joseph Smith. He's not around. Well, it must have been his bodyguard, his friend, that marksman, Porter Rockwell. Let's go get him. And so they arrested him. They brought him in, and they held him there for a while, and they found through the evidence that he probably wasn't guilty. There's not enough evidence here to prove that he's guilty. They took him to a grand jury. The grand jury said, there's not enough evidence here to really take him to trial. So he gets in front of the judge and he says, you know, we're having a hard time coming up with the evidence against you. What evidence do you have, Porter, that it wasn't you that made the attempted assassination on Governor Boggs? And Porter Rockwell simply stated, Judge, he's still alive, isn't he? And with that was evidence enough for the judge to say, you're right, Porter. We know your fame with your guns. And so, yeah, he is still alive. And so it must not have been you. In fact, when word got to Joseph Smith that an attempt had been made on Governor Boggs and that they were blaming Porter, Joseph laughed. He wasn't even worried about his friend. He laughed and he said, it couldn't have been Porter. Governor Boggs is still alive. And so he and Porter had the same opinion, and that was the greatest evidence, and so he was okay. And so he was able to be released from jail at that point, but the Missourians still wanted Porter back. The Missourians got this idea in their mind that if they were able to get Porter, then they would hold him kind of as ransom to get Joseph Smith. Porter would kind of be the bait. We'll get Porter. Joseph will come to rescue his friend, either to testify in court on behalf of his friend, or he'll be brave enough to come down and try to sneak him out of jail, or he'll do something. They figured Porter and Joseph are so close that if we get Porter and hold him, then Joseph, we'll be able to get Joseph. They wanted Joseph back in Missouri so they could kill him. Well, Because of this, Porter decided he was going to take off for a little while. He went over to Pennsylvania, tried to find a little bit of work, couldn't, so he went over to New Jersey, found a little bit of work, but not too much. He decided, enough time's passed, I think I'm going to head back to Nauvoo. I've been hiding long enough. So he gets on a steamship, ends him up, and it drops him off in St. Louis, where he'll then take the march about 100 miles or so north up to Nauvoo. Or he could get on a boat up the Mississippi River. Anyway, he was in St. Louis. There was a member of the church on the boat in St. Louis with Porter. He recognized Porter. He jumps off the ship and in St. Louis, and he goes and finds the sheriff, and he says, Porter Rockwell's on that ship. I'll point him out to you. There he is, right there. This member of the church. He was headed to Nauvoo. So why did the member of the church turn Porter in? Well, because there was a $3,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of Porter Rockwell. Now, $3,000 in Missouri in the late 30s, early 40s was equivalent to about an annual salary. So you think about the annual salary of where you live, that's the reward. And so the guy says, hey, that's Porter. In fact, when he got off, he says to the sheriff, I've got Porter Rockwell on that boat and I want my money. He said it in one sentence. He was just looking for the cash. So the sheriff arrested Porter. He says, we're taking you to Independence to stand trial. And we're not quite sure what we're going to accuse you of yet, but we're going to take you to Independence and throw you in jail anyhow. So they're on their way from St. Louis to Jackson County. And they're in a stagecoach, and Porter's there with the sheriff, and they're handcuffed together. And there's a couple of other people who are on the journey as well to Independence. And the stagecoach driver, he's drunk as a skunk. And he takes a corner too sharp, and the whole thing tops over, and Porter jumps out, still handcuffed to the sheriff, and Porter knows how to fix the carriage. And so he fixes the carriage, he loads everybody back in, makes sure everybody's okay and healthy and whatnot and not injured, gets everybody security, he says, okay, he offers to the sheriff, do you want me to drive? I know how to drive this coach and I'm not drunk. The sheriff says, no, we'll keep going as we're doing. So the guy gets back in the stagecoach, takes off, and he's drunk. He crashes the carriage again, topples over. Porter gets out, puts the carriage back together, makes sure everybody's safe and whatnot. He looks at the sheriff. He says, what do you think? And the sheriff says, yeah, you better get up and drive this carriage. Now, the only significant thing about this story is this one fact that's just kind of humorous, and that is that Porter actually drove himself to jail. The sheriff says, yeah, we got to go to jail, and the only way to get there, Porter, is with your help. So I am arresting you, but would you mind helping me out and driving us to jail so we can put you in and leave you alone and in hopes that we can kill your best friend? What's Porter to do? Well, it's either die in the back of this carriage or drive himself to jail, and so he drives himself to jail. Well, he's there for several months. In fact, the whole time that Porter's in jail in Independence is between 8 and 9 months. He's in this jail cell, and he starts to try to figure out how to escape. He tries a few different ways, and it doesn't work. Then he gets a cellmate. Someone was thrown in jail for being a counterfeiter. And so now Porter's got a friend there in jail with him. And between the two of them, they make a plan that they're going to make a run for it at a particular time with such circumstances and whatnot, and they're going to escape. Well, they did. They got out of jail. Oh, excuse me. Let me back up. Porter attempted to break out of jail, and he was unsuccessful. So he gets thrown back in jail, but this time he gets handcuffed. Right arm to left ankle, left arm to right ankle. And he's put in that position for about 6 weeks until this counterfeiter gets thrown in jail. Well, the counterfeiter had hidden a file in his coat pocket, and so now they've got a file. So Porter talks him into giving him the file. And he works day after day after day after day with that file to free himself of his handcuffs. So now, let me get back to the story where we left off. Now he's got his hands and feet free. They decide to make a jailbreak for it. They decided to go for it. And they were successful. They're running across the prison courtyard, and there's a 12-foot fence that they've got, kind of a chain link fence type, and Porter climbs it, jumps over to the other side. He looks back, and his counterfeiter friend has stumbled and fallen, and he's not going to make it without Porter's help. So Porter jumps back up over the fence into the courtyard, and just then he's met by the jailer's wife. The jailer's wife is coming out to see what the commotion is, and while Porter's going back in to help his cellmate, he runs smack dab into the jailer's wife. And he stops and he says this to the effect. He says, "Oh, miss, excuse me, please beg my pardon, please." And he helps her up, and he says, "Miss, I would love to help make sure that you're not injured, but I'm escaping jail, so I've got to go." It's really how the conversation went. He then went over and helped up his cellmate, and they start running towards the fence. Well, between helping the cellmate and excusing his rudeness to the jailer's wife, Porter was thrown back in jail. He wasn't able to make it. Well, fortunately, by small and simple things, right? Fortunately, he was thrown back in jail, because it wasn't long after that he heard men there in the jail outside the cell talking about a conspiracy that they were organizing to kill the prophet. And they were going to utilize the son of Sidney Rigdon. Sidney Rigdon's a member of the First Presidency. And so they, through deceit, were going to, with the son of Sidney Rigdon, they were going to have access to the prophet. Porter was scared for his friend. Porter prayed. Porter was a man of great faith. He prayed like crazy for some way to get that message all the way to Nauvoo. The very next day, the Lord answers Porter's prayer by sending his mother, Porter's mother, to visit her son. And Porter says, "Mother, I love you and I want to spend time with you, and I'm grateful to see you, but you've got to get back to Nauvoo immediately with the message about this conspiracy, and XYZ is supposed to happen." Well, the mother did. She hightailed it out of there, got back to Nauvoo, told Joseph. Joseph exposed the conspiracy, which shut it down, and his life was spared because Porter was in jail and because Porter received an answer to his prayer. Well, his mother was really concerned after seeing the deplorable conditions that he was in. And so she begged Joseph for help. What do we do with Porter, who's out in jail in Jackson County? And Joseph takes the mother of Porter. Remember, the story goes all the way back to Palmyra. And hand in hand, they walk together from the mansion house in Nauvoo up to the temple site where the temple's being constructed. Joseph stands on top of one of the sunstones that's being carved out there on the temple lot. And he waves his hat over his head, and he hollers out for all the men to gather around. And he explains the situation to Porter Rockwell. Then he passes his hat around looking for donations. They get a good sum of money. And they're starting to walk back to the mansion house when they see a commotion across the field a little ways off. And they go see what's going on. And it's not a bad commotion. Just some of the men in the area were getting together to have some wrestling matches and stick poles and whatnot. Well, Joseph gets a great idea. He goes over and finds the biggest, burliest man who nobody can beat. And he says to the crowd, he says, "I'm going to beat this man in a stick pole right now. And who thinks I can do it?" Not many people did. And he says, "Well, I'm going to bet you all this money in my hat that he had just collected up at the temple lot that I'm going to beat him." And so people threw in their bets. Right now they're gambling, but they've got all their bets on the table. And you know how the story's going to go. Joseph takes this big, muscular man, and he does a stick pull. He throws him over his shoulder, but that's not good enough. Joseph then goes over, and the man's laying on the ground. Joseph rolls him over, grabs him by the collar with one hand, grabs him by the seat pants with the other, hoists him up, and throws him into a ditch of water, and buries his face in the mud and water. Joseph then goes over, he pulls him up, and he says, "No hard feelings." They give a hug. He says, "That was fun." And Joseph collected all of his winnings, and he gave all of that money and the money from the temple lot, which totaled $200. He gave that to Sarah Rockwell, the mother of Porter. She goes down to back to Jackson County. This is no small walk. This is like 350 miles. She walks back to Jackson County, and she hires Alexander Donovan, a friend of the prophet Joseph, a friend of the members of the church who had stood as lawyer in their defense on several other occasions. He's now Porter's attorney. Well, Alexander Donovan takes him, Porter in front of the judge, and he says, hey, for whatever reason you're holding Porter here for these last 8 months, you need to release him right now. The judge says, how come? And he says, because you have failed to provide charges and you have failed to provide a speedy trial. And so you're breaking the law by holding this man. And so the judge said, Alexander, you're right. And so they released Porter Rockwell. Well, Porter Rockwell had been in this deplorable condition for 8 months. He would later say that the food they gave him was so disgusting and horrible and rotten and smelly and old and just the worst thing ever. And he later said that what he didn't eat one day, they'd put it in front of him to eat it the next day. And so he couldn't get fresh food until he ate the garbage of the day before. Well, this is how his 8 months went. And so you can imagine the condition that he's in. He never had a change of clothes, never had a shower, and he never had a haircut. So this is where he gets his long hair and long beard. And he goes into Nauvoo, and he's still scared of being returned to jail, and so he's going very fast, and he's hiding in the bushes, staying off the road all the way across Missouri, and then he gets into Nauvoo. Well, he gets into Nauvoo on Christmas Day, of all days, and he goes straight to the mansion house. That's the nickname of the house that Joseph and Emma live in. And he goes to the mansion house, and he pretends to be drunk. He barges through the door. He's loud. He's threatening. He smells. He looks disgusting. And Joseph takes a look at what's going on, the commotion, and he yells, "Get that drunk Missourian out of here." Now that gives you a clue as to how the members of the church felt about Missourians. He says, "Get that drunk," he didn't know who he was, of course. He said, "Get that drunk Missourian out of here." And so a couple of guys went over and tried to get Porter out of the house. They couldn't do it. They couldn't wrestle him. He was too strong. So Joseph takes off his coat and he goes to do it himself. He grabs the man by the collar and starts escorting him out the front door of the mansion house. Well, the man looks at Joseph. They catch each other's eyes. And the man starts to laugh. Joseph realizes who it was. It's his childhood best friend in the whole wide world. He throws his arms around Porter. And he brings Porter back into the party. He gets out of chair and he sits him down. He's the center of attention now. And he is Joseph's number one guest in the house. Joseph calls everybody in the house together, the whole party, to sit around. And he says, now I want all of you to listen to Porter talk about what he's been through the last 8 months. And he relates the conditions that he was in and why he's looking the way he did. And this is now where the prophecy comes about his hair, or how we, over the years, have thought that there's a prophecy about his hair. But it's so much better than that. You know, in church history, the truth is so much cooler than the stories that have been exaggerated and distorted over time. Because here's the real story, and it's right out of church history. There's no fable here. You go look up the history of the church. I think it's volume 4 or 6 or something, and this quote is there. Joseph tells his friend, he's with his long hair and his long beard, he says, as long as you are true and faithful to your covenants, to the church and to your God, no bullet or blade will ever harm you. Nothing about hair, not yet. He says, if you're true and faithful to your covenants, to your church, to your God, no bullet or blade will ever harm you. In response to that covenant, Porter decided to leave his hair long as a token that he accepted that covenant. Now, it's been changed over the years. that the hair is what kept Porter safe. No. Porter made a covenant with God via a prophet that if he was faithful to his covenants, to the church and to God, that would protect him from his enemies. And in response, Porter showed an outward expression of his commitment to that covenant by committing to not cut his hair. That was his way of saying, I'm all in. And he didn't break his covenant. Of course, he cut his hair later to give, as I explained, to Don Carlos's widow a wig. But he didn't. I'll tell you how he died, and it wasn't because of a bullet. He was true and faithful to his covenants the rest of his life. Was Porter Rockwell endowed? Yes, he was, in the Nauvoo Temple. Porter Rockwell, after being endowed, he would be sealed. It could have been before or after, but either way, he was sealed to 3 women at 3 different times. He didn't practice polygamy, but he was sealed by Joseph to his wife, and then by Brigham to the next 2 wives that he had. The first one divorced Porter, the second one died, and then he married the third one as a consequence. And so the other 2 times he was sealed, it was by under the hand of Brigham. He also acted as an officiator in the Nauvoo Temple for an endowment ceremony, and an officiator in the endowment house in Salt Lake. So he was part of a live endowment. It is recorded what role he played in that endowment presentation. You can guess which role he played. And it's recorded in the history of the church that he played a particular role that only Porter could have played, and apparently he played it really well. But he was true and faithful to his covenants his whole life, and that's why it was. Now he gets to Nauvoo. He doesn't have any job. He doesn't have a job. He doesn't have any money, and so Joseph wants to take care of him the best he can. Well, Emma one day, or for a few weeks because of the time it took, she went down to St. Louis to look for furniture to furnish the mansion house. And so while she was away, Joseph wanted to take care of his buddy Porter and give him an opportunity to make a little bit of an income. And so while Emma was away, Joseph invited in a couple of the carpenters who were working on the temple to come into the mansion house, and there in the front parlor to set up a bar. And so right there in the mansion house, they put up a bar stools, and they were serving drinks out of the mansion house, and Porter was the bartender. This is how he made a living. And so, as the story goes, Emma comes home, takes a couple of steps through the front door, sees Porter there in a black suit, white shirt, a bolo tie, a very nice hat, looking very good with his long hair and long beard, of course. And he's polishing up some whiskey glasses. And Emma walks in and sees this scene. And she turns to Joseph and says, essentially, either that goes or I go. Well, Joseph has the bar dissembled, taken out the front door, and put across the street, literally across the street, just less than a stone's throw from the front door of the mansion house. If you've been to Nauvoo, across the street from the mansion house is a big, nice, pretty grass field. Right there was a saloon operated by Porter Rockwell, and that's how he earned his living. Well, we've spent a lot of time together tonight. We've said some good stories, but I want to leave you with the best story, and that is this. In June 1844, Joseph received word that he was to be arrested and taken to Carthage on trial. Joseph and Hiram Willard Richards, who was an apostle, and Porter Rockwell got into a boat late one night and made their way across the Mississippi River to Iowa. Some people have thought that Joseph, some of the enemies of the church have said that Joseph was abandoning the saints of Nauvoo. On the contrary, he was headed to Iowa under the disguise of the darkness of the night so that he could secure some horses and make his way to Washington, D.C. to plead his case with the federal government. Not for redress, like they did with Missouri, not looking for payback, but for protection. The mobs were getting bad. The situation in Nauvoo was stressful. Everybody was on super high alert, and Joseph was risking his life by beelining it to D.C. to beg and plead for the constitutional protections which were granted to him as an American citizen, and to have the federal government intervene to the unconstitutional actions of the Illinois Governor Ford, as well as the mobs who were led by corrupt judges and sheriffs and marshals and whatnot. So they get to the other side of the river, and they're starting to make their plan. Now, it was true that after they go to D.C. and get things right and get the federal government to come in and intervene, then they were going to make their way to the Rocky Mountains, over to the Salt Lake Valley, to await Brigham bringing the saints. And so that's the whole story. But they were there on the Iowa side of the Mississippi River late at night. A bunch of holes in the rowboat, and so Joseph and Hiram are spending the time throwing the water out while Porter's rowing him this party across the river. And if you've been to Nauvoo and you stood at the end of Parley Street and you look across the river to the Iowa side, you see how long a distance it is, and to row all the way across. Well, as soon as they get there, the first thing Joseph does is he has a thought. He wants to send a message to Emma, and so he writes a letter and he sends it to Emma. So Porter gets back in that hole-filled boat, rows himself back across the Mississippi, heads to the mansion house, hands it to Emma. Emma reads the letter. We're not sure what it said. Emma writes a letter back to Joseph, gives it to Porter. He gets back in that hole-filled boat, rows himself across the Mississippi, now for the third time in the night, gives it to Joseph. There was also a man by the name of Reynolds Cahoon who came with Porter back the second time. And between Emma's letter and the verbal slander that Cahoon brought with him against the prophet Joseph, Joseph made that statement, that famous statement, "If my life is of no value to my friends, then it is no value to me." And he decided that he would go and turn himself into Carthage, at Carthage. But before he did, while he's still making that decision whether or not to get back in the boat and head back to Nauvoo, he turns to his friend Porter and he says, "Old Port, what do I do?" And Porter says, "Joseph, you're the oldest. You'll know what's best. You make your bed and I'll lie in it with you." In other words, Joseph, I'm with you. You want to go to D.C. into the Rocky Mountains? I'll carry you on my back. If you want to go to Carthage, I'll go and die with you. Either way, Joseph, it's you and me. He then turns to Hiram. Hiram, what do you think? Hiram says, "Joseph, I think we better get going." To Carthage, he meant. Reynolds Cahoon, Willard Richards, and Hiram Smith get in the rowboat. Joseph pulls Porter aside. And in somewhat confidence, he tells Porter that he is going to die at Carthage. He says, "This is it." He says, "I will not live. They will murder me." And with that, Porter and Joseph join the others in the boat. It's important to remember that little private conversation as the story continues to unfold. They get in that hole-filled boat. Porter, for the fourth time now, rows that party across the river. The mobs allow the men to go home for the night, and they'll head for Carthage the following morning. Joseph's able to spend the evening and through the night with his wife and his children. Emma, who's 5 months pregnant at this point, who would become little David Smith, born 4 months after the martyrdom. And then the following morning, those same men, Porter, Hiram, Joseph, Willard, and now John Taylor, would all get together and go to turn themselves in at Carthage. As they're at the mansion house, saying their final goodbyes to Emma and to Lucy, their dear mother, Joseph pulls Porter aside once again. And he says, "Porter, you're not coming with me to Carthage." And Porter says, "Joseph, I'm your bodyguard. Of course I'm going to Carthage." And he says, "No, Porter, you have more important things to do. If you go to Carthage, they will kill you." And Porter says, "I don't care, I'm coming." And Joseph says, "Then I command you not to come with me to Carthage. Porter, out of love for his friend and out of obedience to the prophet of God, stayed behind in Nauvoo. Well, Joseph would go to Carthage, and tonight we won't recount all the details of what happened there in Carthage, but needless to say, there was a conspiracy to kill the prophet. The Carthage Greys let it happen, and they spilt the best blood of the 19th century, as it would later be said of them, in killing Joseph and Hiram. Just before they were to pass away, Porter went to the mansion house. A day or two before, they had a meeting there, and he had left his hat. He went to retrieve his hat, and while he was there retrieving his hat, he overheard in the adjoining room Thomas Ford, the governor of Illinois, the very man who had sworn to protect the prophet Joseph. He was there in the mansion house, having breakfast served to him by Emma in the morning of June 27th, 1844, the very day of the martyrdom. And Porter overhears, while Emma's not in the room, Ford say, "Well, by now the deed is done." Porter's not sure what the deed is, but he knows that things aren't well at Carthage. He gets on a horse and rides as fast as he can towards Carthage, the only time he would be disobedient to the prophet. He gets he's on his way to Carthage, and remember, the church is coming the opposite direction. And the man coming the opposite direction didn't bother slowing down. He just screams out, "They've killed Joseph and Hiram," and he keeps on going. Well, Hiram turns around before the mob's going to kill him, and he heads back to Nauvoo. June 27th, the very day of the martyrdom, he gets back to Nauvoo after dark. And he's riding quickly, but in a very solemn way, through up and down every street in Nauvoo, screaming out, more lamenting in anguish and pain, saying, "They have killed him. They have killed Joseph. They have killed Hiram. They have killed him." And he would repeat that quote over and over and over through the night there in Nauvoo. The story goes that Joseph and Hiram, they come home, they have the viewing and the funeral, they're buried. Brigham, as the president of the Quorum of the 12, is now leading the church. Several months go by, and the mobs are now getting too close to Nauvoo, harassing too much, and it's time to get out. Porter, at this point, had been deputized. He's the law now, and he can take the law legally in his own hands. Well, he's there, and he's on guard duty, and a mob comes into town, and they're coming in to kill Brigham. And they're making their way down to Brigham's house. And with the intent to kill, Deputy Rockwell had not only the legal authority, but the legal obligation to stand in defense of an innocent citizen of Nauvoo, that being Brigham Young. And so he shot and killed the leader of the mob. It was later found out, just within hours, but later found out that it was none other than a man by the name of Frank Worrell. Worrell, if I'm pronouncing that right. I know I'm pronouncing Frank right. Frank Worrell. Frank Worrell was the leader, the main guy at Carthage that led the mob up the stairs into the bedroom and fatally shot Hiram and Joseph. Frank was probably the murderer of Joseph Smith. Porter Rockwell just killed him, not knowing who it was until after he was dead. Well, so they get out of Nauvoo. I'm trying to figure out how much of the story I'm going to skip here, but they get out of Nauvoo to keep our focus on Porter. Brigham's making his way across Iowa, and excuse me. And let's back up just a minute here. Before they start making their way across Iowa, something important that happens, I think, as a result of Porter killing Frank Worrell. They now know that Porter's in town. he's taken the law into his hands because he legally can. Frank, the main leader, is dead. And the mobs kind of go quiet for a while. And they have to reorganize. They have to get up their courage again. It's almost like they got to start over. And so in my mind, I see small and simple things here. Porter, standing in defense of Brigham, killing Frank, I think, slowed the pace of the mob down long enough for all the saints to safely get out of Nauvoo before anybody died. And so I think that incident of Porter and Frank made it possible for a peaceful exit out of Nauvoo. Well, anyway, now we got Brigham and the saints are starting to move. They're across Iowa into winter quarters. Porter's out there with Brigham, and he says, "Hey, before we finish going off to Salt Lake, I've got a mission for you, and this is what I want you to do. Now, you are a wanted man in Missouri. They will kill you if they find you. You're a wanted man in Illinois because you shot and killed Frank, and they will shoot and kill you on sight. And so you're a wanted man. It's very dangerous for you to do what I'm asking you to do, but I want you to go back into Nauvoo, and I want you to turn yourself in for the murder of Frank Worrell." Now, how would you react? How did Porter react? "Brigham, you're a prophet. I'll follow you to the grave and back if I have to. So if you're asking me to go to the grave, I'll do it." So he heads back to Nauvoo. Here's the idea. Brigham's great idea. And it has to do with delaying the mob to get everybody safely out. They're starting to regroup. They're starting to get re-energized. And now they're mad. Frank's dead. These saints aren't moving fast enough. Let's go in and just kill them. That's the mob mentality. And so Brigham says, "Porter, go turn yourself in and watch what happens." So Porter goes back into town. And he's walking through town. You know, the sun's shining. It's light. He's walking through. "Hey, I'm Porter Rockwell. Here I am. Come arrest me." Well, it's not really happening. So he figures, well, maybe what I'll do is maybe I'll commit a crime. So that way they take notice and they'll come and get me. And so he sees a former enemy of himself. He sees an enemy he sees a man who Porter considered to be an enemy of him. And so he sees the man and he says, "Hey, you're my enemy. I'm Porter. I'm going to kill you." You know, I mean, it's just blatant, trying to be obvious here. And the man turns and he starts to run down the streets there in Nauvoo. And Porter pulls out a couple of his guns and he's shooting rounds right over the man's head. He doesn't want to kill him. He just wants to bring attention to himself. Finally, after all these desperate attempts for some attention, the sheriff sees that Porter Rockwell's in town. So he goes, knocks on Porter's door, and Porter pretends to put up kind of a stink and, "No, I'm not coming out, and you got to come in if you want me," type of thing. But eventually he walks out with his hands up and with a smile on his face gets arrested. The plan worked. Now what's the plan? To continue to delay the mob. Now all the focus is on Porter, on the trial of Porter. The mob is looking at him. They want to get Porter. And what's going on behind the back of the mob? All the saints are safely, securely, freely getting out of Nauvoo. So Porter's risking his life in an attempt to save 12,000 members of the church. As far as I know, not a single one of them died at the hands of the mob getting out of Nauvoo. 4 months would pass by, and Porter was brought in front of a judge and jury and found that he acted in self-defense by shooting and killing Frank Worrell. So he was released, let go, and able to head out to catch up with Brigham Young and be the scout and the leader of the Vanguard Company. And here I just brought you back to where we started about an hour ago in our conversations. How did he die? So the prophecy that you've heard, that I've now debunked about his hair being the protection, he cut his hair, he gave it to Don Carlos's widow in California, and anybody who's not a member of the church was after him. So he lost his hair, everybody's shooting at him. How did he die? Well, very quietly, actually. On Saturday, June 8th, 1878, he went to a play with his daughter in Salt Lake. And when the play was nearing its end, Porter said, "Yeah, I don't feel very good. I'd like to go home and just lay down," which he did. He went and laid down in his bed. And early on Sunday morning, June 9th, 1878, Porter sat up in bed with energy he hadn't had in the previous 24 hours. And he looks around, he goes and he grabs his boots, his cowboy boots. He puts them on as if he's going somewhere. And he lays down on his bed and he dies peacefully with his boots on, as if he had somewhere to go. Porter died at the hands of a heart attack, they would discover. Not at the hands of mob or enemy or anything else that could have been more fitting for the end of a man who we remember as being a Westerner, wild, wild west, shoot 'em up, ask questions later type of guy. But he died peacefully and quietly. Now, why was he able to do that? Why was he able to go his whole life and avoid all of the negative, deadly circumstances that otherwise would have been his or any other somewhat outlaw in the Wild West? It was because of the prophecy of Joseph Smith and his adherence to that prophecy. Now, it wasn't just a prophecy of, don't cut your hair and you'll be just fine. It was a prophecy of, Orrin, you'll be just fine, but you got to do your part as well. And you'll remember what his part was. The quote once again, and this is where we'll end tonight. As long as you are true and faithful to your covenants, to the church and to your God, no bullet or blade would ever harm you. Now, I've always been a big believer, and this is why I love church history, that if Nephi says we can relate the scriptures to ourselves, I say we can relate church history to ourselves as well. And so with that quote, how do we relate that to ourselves? Maybe nobody's shooting guns at us or coming at us with blades. But could the prophet also say, as long as you are true and faithful to your covenants, to the church and to your God, XYZ will never harm you? Well, maybe we'll still have trials and heartaches and hardships and whatnot, but maybe like Porter, if we just don't give up on what we know to be true and right, maybe the Lord will see us through those tough times. He did it for Porter, and any promise that is given to Porter or any other member of the church, as Joseph would say, all members of the church are eligible for such a promise. And so it can be for us. Porter's great. He lived great and was a wonderful example, not of being a rough and tough man, although he was, but being true and faithful to his covenants, to the church, to his God, and most importantly, maybe not most importantly, but in addition, to his best friend, the prophet of the restoration, the prophet Joseph Smith. And I say that in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.